Here's a question from Eric. How might I engage in the tactics approach with someone who claims to be a strict empiricist? In other words, what are some questions I can ask someone who claims that he only believes in things he can see? I'm hoping to demonstrate that it is impossible to live this out consistently.
Oh, yeah, of course it is, because virtually everything, let me back up, a massive amount of the things we know with a certainty have nothing to do with what we've learned from our five senses, all right? I actually had this come up during a talk that I gave at a university in the South somewhere, and a student raised his hand and offered this challenge. And I simply asked him, and by the way, the way to deal with this is just to offer clear case counterexamples. In other words, examples of things that are obviously so, but are contrary to the person's point of view. So I said, do you know what you're thinking right now? And he said, yes. I said, are you smelling it, tasting it, feeling it, seeing it, or hearing it? Trying to get all the five in there, right? No, you know what you're thinking through a different faculty, and that's direct cognition, direct awareness. We are directly connected to our own thoughts, all right? So all of the sensations we have, all the thoughts in our minds, all the beliefs that we have, we know all of these things, but we don't know them by our five senses, okay? Think about everything that you're pretty confident you know about things that happened before you were born, like all of history, all right? Or things that are the case in places you've never been. How do you know all those things? Not by anything that your five, including most of what you know about science. You know those things not by the deliverance of your five senses. You know those things by authority. Now, you need your five senses to be able to attain the information from an authority about something, but it isn't the five senses that renders that information true. It's reliable because you rely on the authority. And so it turns out that there are massive amounts of information that we think is true. There's all kinds of knowledge we have that we're quite confident in that has not been a result of a deliverance of the five senses. And by the way, that challenge or that point of view is itself self-refuting, because the individual, and if I could kind of put it in a more crisp way, I know that we can't know anything except those things that are delivered to us by our five senses. Okay, that's empiricism. But wait a minute, that sentence that you know is not something, that proposition that you've just made is not something you know by the deliverances of your five senses. You think it's justified for a different reason, but not because anything about your five senses has taught you that. So it doesn't fulfill its own requirement. It suffers, or it's invalidated in virtue of self-refutation. It commits suicide, to use the tactical language. And so this is where these kinds of questions can be used. Do you know what you're thinking? Do you know when you were born? Do you know? I mean, I'm just trying to think. Maybe that's not the best one, when you were born, but yeah, well, you know when you were born because someone told you, But all of these things that we know that we have no access to by our own personal five senses, all right? In other words, those things are not what justifies our knowledge. And then pointing out that this point that's being made is self-refuting. So the question would be, that thing that you just said, that empiricism is the way to know things, that's the only reliable way of knowing things. Do you think that's true? Yes, of course I do. Would you say you know that? Yes, of course I know that. Okay, tell me what empirical method validates that statement. Okay, there's your questions. Going to the point of the self-refutation of that particular proposition. And, I mean, that ought to be adequate. Now, it ought to be adequate to any reasonable person. And by the way, there's a whole bunch of very, very popular ideas that eventually gave way to this understanding that is self-refuting. Verificationism, which is a very popular notion in the early 20th century, and it endured for a while. It's a version of this empirical claim, was the idea that unless you can verify any proposition by the scientific method or by use of the five senses, then the statement is meaningless. So when we say that rape is wrong, for example, we're not saying anything meaningful because there's no way to verify that by any scientific test, by any sensory experience. Therefore, all we're doing is expressing our emotions. This view is called emotivism. Okay, very popular. Verificationism collapses into emotivism with these kinds of statements that can't be verified in that way. Of course, verification lost ground because people began to reflect, and I don't know why they didn't get this right away, that the notion of verificationism cannot be verified by the five senses or any scientific method, and this is why it eventually died on the vine. There are a lot of points of view that are like that, and this one that's being stated is an example.
You mentioned a moral statement, and that's another example. You cannot prove a moral statement with scientific experiments.
That's right.
You can prove, maybe you can prove that something causes someone to feel pain, but you can't prove right and wrong. You can't prove any sort of moral quality.
You can't demonstrate that causing them pain is a wrong thing to do.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, let's go on to a question from Scott. What is the purpose behind God making animals and people with senses that can't find him? So if we can't find God through these empiricist means, why would God make us that way?
Okay, well, there's an assumption there. Okay, so this is an example of a complex question. The question assumes something that hasn't been established, and on the basis of that assumption, the question is asked. The classic way of putting this, and, obviously silly, is, are you still beating your wife? Well, that presumes that you had been beating your wife, and you're asked if you are now. So if you say no or yes, then you're still stuck with implicitly affirming this other thing that's not been established. It's also characteristic of when people say, who created God? The assumption there is that God was created, and now you're asking who did it. Okay, but why would we think that God, the kind of God we're talking about, would be a God that needs to be created? That's the question. Okay, in this particular case, could you read the question once more, and I'll show you what I mean.
What is the purpose behind God making animals and people with senses that can't find him?
Oh, okay, the presumption there is that human beings have senses that have no ability to be used to draw the conclusion that God exists. Why would anybody say that? An atheist would say that. I'm not sure what Scott's view is, but Romans 1 says, behold nature, Romans 1, 18 and following, that which is known about God can be seen through what has been made. In other words, we look at physical things, the nature of the universe, and we can properly infer the existence of God. And by the way, apart from the theological issues, we do this all the time. We look at the weather. Jesus famously said, you can read the signs of the weather, you can't read the signs of the times. Well, when we read the signs of the weather, we infer certain things from physical manifestations. We infer things about other people, because that we can't see. Their consciousness, their ability to make decisions and exercise their will, go through moral emotions and all of that. All of these things are invisible things, but we watch the physical behaviors, and from the physical behaviors, we infer certain things about non-physical things. This happens all the time, and it certainly happens with God. Classic case, more recent case of an expression of what Paul was talking about in Romans chapter 1 is the DNA double helix and the information on that. I mean, this is like millions of books of information that are encoded in the DNA double helix of human beings. The question is, who wrote that code? The fact that there's code is an indication that someone wrote the code. So I'm looking at your computer right now, and I see words you're reading from them, right? But I could read from them, and what I conclude from that, if you weren't here, is that someone typed this stuff out into language that I can read. So I am inferring an agent even if I don't see you. All I got to see is what's on your screen, and I know that an agent has been involved in producing that. Okay? So I have senses that I'm using to look at physical um, elements that turn out to be tokens regarding linguistic communication. And in fact, I can read it because I know how the tokens work with the types, what the letters and the words represent, so I can get information from it. The fact is, there are all kinds of ways we use our five senses to come to the conclusion that an agent is responsible for what we see. And sometimes that's easily explained by a human agent, my example with your computer, but sometimes we have a circumstance where we see things like complex code, writing, that can't be explained by a human agent, and that's the DNA double helix. That's just one of many examples, by the way, in the natural realm, but there you go. So we have evidence that we see of teleology, of purpose and design in nature that parallels human activity. We see human beings as agents producing things like this, and we know that they wouldn't be produced apart from agency. That's why the Microsoft guy, what's his name? Richest,
Bill Gates?
Bill Gates. Bill Gates looks at the DNA molecule or the double helix and says, this is computer code. That's what it is, and we know where code comes from. So in this case, there is no human agent that is feasible, possible, being responsible for the code that's on the gene. Therefore, there must be some non-human agent. No natural agent, must be a supernatural agent. So this is something we presume that we are able to access through our senses that give us reason to believe there was a supernatural agent that was involved in the creation of the universe.
And of course, God also interacted with people in history. All you have to do is look at all the ways he interacted with Israel audibly and through miracles and through various events. I mean, there were all sorts of ways that he interacted, just as we can look back in history at other interactions people have had and know that those people
Or Jesus.
existed.
Jesus reveals the Father. Here he is.
He also revealed Revelation. We have access to Revelation. That's something we can read, that we can hear directly from God. So there are all sorts of ways God has revealed himself, and it's all available to everyone, including what you mentioned in Romans 1, where people can know about God's power and what does it say? His divine nature. And
right. And
so,
by the way, if Scott is an atheist, or he's offering the challenge of an atheist, the atheist might say, well, I don't accept any of those things. Well, fine. You're not obliged to. Accepting the evidence that our senses are able to deliver to us is different from saying our senses have no ability to gather evidence regarding God. That's the point we're making here. The challenge is not a legitimate challenge. There's a presumption that's not sound that's behind the question.
Also, if it's the case that no one can find God because our senses we're completely cut off from him, why is it the case that every people group, every culture throughout history that we know of has always believed in some sort of supernatural world?
Right.
So how is it that people not connected with each other at all, it's not as if it's spread to, all these different cultures, but everyone has had some awareness of a supernatural world?
So in that sense, atheism is really the odd view, because people don't naturally come to the conclusion that there's nothing but, meat all the way down, so to speak, and nothing but molecules clashing in the universe. That is a modern notion, although it shows up, in ancient philosophy. But characteristically, as you say, this is people's natural response. What they see in the world, they infer from that, because it implies that there is a divine creator.
In fact, I think that they've done studies. I'm trying to think of what exactly when this was, but where children, I remember
Oh,
reading an
yes.
article
Yeah.
where the atheists were like, we have to beat this out of children. I mean,
Right.
not literally beat it out,
Yes.
but we have to teach children not to infer from design the existence of the supernatural.
Right.
And it's something that children automatically do. And so this is why I object to the idea when atheists say they're the default position. They're not the default position. If they were the default position, then
Everybody would be defaulting to it.
right. It's not the case that nobody believes in anything supernatural and we all have to go out there and work to try and convince them. It's the opposite.
Even the children of atheists, right?
Right.
I'm familiar with the same quote. I wish I knew where it was, but I heard it just recently. So this is just a matter of research that they've unveiled this. This is because, as Doug Axe has pointed out, we all have a design intuition. We know when we see something that takes know-how to make it. And that's what we see in the universe. Just like this computer, there's your iPhone, here's my, the writing on this page. That takes know-how. And we have the ability to see that also in the natural realm.